Data collection methods. This lesson is about data collection methods, which is a new stage in the research process. We all know that the research process is cyclical in nature. It begins with the identification of a research problem. This is to be followed by the literature review. Once this is done, the researcher will make a research design. At the level of research design, a number of decisions are taken. Some are conceptual and some are technical. Once this is done, the researcher should collect the data. Here, this is the stage of data collection. Data collection is done via a number of standardized methods, which are related to one's methodology. This is to be followed by data analysis and interpretation, and finally the researcher will report his research in a research report. This can be a dissertation, an article, or something else. The data collection step is crucial to scientific inquiry because it offers researchers genuine evidence to answer their research questions. It leads them to have evidence. The answers allow researchers to corroborate, refute, or alter existing theories. Without real data, research lacks empirical evidence. It is data that make research empirical, and it is impossible to resolve the research problem. Data have a lot of forms, and they can be collected using a variety of instruments, or tools, or methods. They are also called the means of research. Researchers, therefore, should know about these tools and how they are designed and used. First of all, it is important to define data. Data is the plural of datum, and this refers to the information gathered in a research study. This means the real evidence or material found in the real world. Data are not to be found in the literature. They can't be found in the literature. They are found in the real world. For example, if one is interested in knowing about the views or the opinions of a population of teachers about the effectiveness of an educational system, here a thorough literature review will help the researcher to collect some theoretical background information on this system, its origins and how it is structured, etc. However, the researcher will not be able to find the opinions of the teachers in the previous literature. I mean here the teachers in the target population. The researcher may come across previous studies involving the views gathered from other populations about the same system, but the views of the target population will not be found in the literature. Therefore, it is essential that the researcher contacts these people or a representative sample of them to learn about their opinions through interviewing or responding to a questionnaire, for example. The answers to the questions are the research data. They are the source of new knowledge. Data can be spoken or written, or they can take other forms. This is related to the nature of the phenomenon being investigated. For example, in some studies, data take the form of numbers. In others, they take the form of texts, pictures, sounds, videos, images, etc. Let's talk now about data types. The first categorization that we can have is to talk about primary and secondary data. This categorization is related to the source of data. We categorize data according to their sources. Primary data are produced originally. They are produced by the researcher himself. Primary data can be collected by certain means, for example, measurement, using a test, observation, participating in the research context, interrogation, here asking questions, or participation. In your case, you will be collecting primary data. Collecting primary data is time-consuming, and sometimes this type of collection is impossible, such as the case of past phenomena. Secondary data, on the other hand, are taken from other studies. It means they are data which are the result of studies by other people before the researcher. Secondary data cover, for example, written materials such as annual reports made by some agencies or governments or any other bodies, production records which are related to manufacturers and industries, personal data, committee reports, and minutes of meetings, communications such as emails, letters, notes, publications, such as books, journals, newspapers, advertising, copy and government publications of all kinds. They cover also non-written materials such as television programs, radio programs, tape recordings, videotapes, films of all types, including documentary, live reporting, interviews, works of art, and historical artifacts. Also, they cover survey data, and this is a very important category of secondary data, like government census of population, of employment, household surveys, economic data, organizational surveys of markets, sales, economic forecasts, employee attitudes. The reliability of secondary data varies. They are not always reliable. Therefore, researchers have to assess them carefully by referring to their sources. The use of secondary data is a matter of discipline. Some disciplines use primary data more than secondary, and others use secondary data. Another categorization of data is into quantitative data and qualitative data. Quantitative data include numbers. They have a numerical form. For example, in some studies, a researcher administers a test and he collects scores. These scores are the data and they are quantitative in nature. Another case is when the researcher uses observation by resorting to the use of a checklist. Whenever a phenomenon is present, he observes that a phenomenon is present, he uses a check. So at the end of the observation, the data will take the form of check marks, and these can be, they are in fact numerical in nature. They are numerical because they can be quantified. Qualitative data, on the other hand, include non-numerical data. For example, notes. A researcher is observing, but he's not using check marks. He's writing something. He's writing notes. These are qualitative in nature. They take the form of words. Another case is the case of interview transcripts or texts which are to be analyzed, minutes of meetings, historical records, memos and recollections, documentary films and audio recordings. Qualitative data are worded data. For example, colors. Blue, white, green, these are words. Days of the week. Brands, animals. Now, if we move to quantitative data themselves, they can be discrete or continuous. Discrete data or discrete values are exact values or whole numbers. Like, for example, the number of pupils in a class. It can be 1 or 2. It can't be 1.5, for instance. It is a whole number. 1 is a whole number. 2 is a whole number. Shoe size, the same thing. Score rolled on a die. The frequency an event happens. if we take the continuous type of quantitative data, these are measured quantities that are rounded. It means they can have decimals. For instance, time or length, mass, capacity. Here we can have numbers like 2.6, 7.8, and so on. Here the question that arises is, why should we know about types of data? The answer is very simple. This is related to the next stage, which is data analysis. Different types of data require special methods of collection, and also they require special methods of analysis especially. Here, quantitative data can be treated using simple or complex statistics. We can use statistics with quantitative data, while with qualitative data, which generally appear in the form of words, the researcher cannot analyze them mathematically because they involve qualities and not quantities. At the end, we say that data collection is a very important stage, and the researcher should know how to collect data. That is to say, the researcher should know about data collection methods. Data collection methods. Depending on the objectives of the study, the approach, and the methodology, researchers employ a variety of methods to collect data. The following are the most important ones. Some other methods do exist depending on the discipline. Let's begin with interviews. An interview is a method of data collection which makes use of oral questions. The aim is to elicit from the respondents oral answers on precise topics, which are related to the research problem, of course, in the form of a conversation. The researcher who uses interviewing is considered a miner or a traveler, since interviews are specially designed to search profoundly into various phenomena from the perspective of individuals. In addition, interviews are distinguished by interaction between the interviewer and the interviewee. It is conducted for a specific research purpose, for instance, to acquire knowledge about a certain topic or some sphere of human experience. Interviews are used in some types of research because they have some advantages. Firstly, the interview permits researchers to examine unobservable phenomena such as beliefs and opinions, and perceptions and attitudes. Secondly, interviews can generate supplementary or additional data if initial information is not sufficient. This is especially done in mixed methods research. A further advantage is that interviews can make respondents more comfortable to provide complete answers using the conversational mode. Conversation is very important to make people feel comfortable. Also, interviews make a room for the use of the respondent's first language, and this would reduce the effect that lack of proficiency can have on the quantity and the quality of the data gathered. Finally, interviews are characterized by depth. They provide deep and profound information in the treatment of observed phenomena. For these reasons, interviews are sometimes preferred, and they are suitable for some types of research, while they are not suitable for other types. This depends on the research paradigm. Interviews are not done in the same way. There are types of interviews. Here we can distinguish three types: the structured interview, the semi-structured interview, and the unstructured interview. 3 types. This depends on one issue. It is whether their content or the questions which are included are controlled in advance by the researcher or not. We mean here whether they are prepared in advance by the researcher or not. In the case of the structured interview, we'll see that it is the most controlled type. The researcher prepares a list of questions before the interview and then asks a number of individuals the same set of questions. The purpose is to gather their responses to the same questions. It is in this way that this interview is structured. When the answers are collected, the researcher can evaluate the responses related to specific topics. It is important to say that structured interviews are similar to questionnaires or surveys. The succession, it means the sequence and phrasing, the wording of the questions are determined by means of a schedule prepared beforehand. The interview schedule means the list of questions prepared in advance. Here we notice that little freedom is left to the interviewer to make changes or to add questions. In the schedule, the researcher can use a number or various types of questions. They can be, for example, fixed alternative items, like yes or no questions, agree, disagree questions, and so on. Also, the researcher can use open-ended items, here WH questions. Another option is to use scales of fixed alternatives like strongly agree, agree, or undecided, disagree, strongly disagree. This is a scale because it has degrees. Of course, there are advantages and disadvantages of these types of questions. The choice is left to the researcher. Now we come to the second type of interviews, which is the semi-structured interview. This type includes a few predetermined main questions. However, the researcher has the freedom to digress or probe for more information by asking additional questions which are not prepared before. These are called probes. Here some answers may lead the researcher to think of other possible details that might increase his or her understanding of certain phenomena from the perspective of the respondents themselves. It is in this way that this type of interview is semi-structured. This means that the questions are partly controlled by the researcher and prepared beforehand, while some set of questions are not prepared. This aspect of semi-structured interviews adds flexibility to the predetermined categories, while allowing researchers to follow up on ambiguous or imprecise responses by adding further why and how questions. These are, as I said, called probes. The last type of interviews is the unstructured interview. This type of interview is the most flexible type of interview because they are completely open. That is to say, the researcher does not prepare questions before. The researcher announces the main issue to be discussed, then follows the course of the interview, focusing on interesting topics and stimulating or encouraging the interview to say more through questions that are not prepared before. Of course, all the questions should guide the interviewer in order not to talk about unrelated topics. Unstructured interviews are very, very flexible. They allow the participants to express their own views, that is to say, to have their own categories. They can discuss topics that are significant to themselves, rather than reacting to topics anticipated or predicted by the researcher in advance. Unstructured interviews are richer, but they are more difficult to use and to analyze. They are more difficult to use because the researcher should be able to control the conversation. And they are very difficult to analyze because the researcher does not have predetermined categories and he has to find the categories to discover them by himself. Now we come to talk about the disadvantages of using interviews. Although interviews serve in gathering very profound data or rich data, they have a number of drawbacks. The first is that they are prolonged. Therefore, researchers must reduce the number of participants. I mean here that in case you are using an interview, it's not necessary to have a large number of participants, because having a large number of participants will make the analysis huge, the data huge, and the analysis extremely difficult. The second disadvantage is that interviews may involve bias. They may involve bias, or the researcher here can influence the interviewee. Interviewers must be cautious to lessen their manipulation of respondents. They should not manipulate the respondents by using leading questions or showing that some responses are preferred rather than other responses. We mean here by bias is that the researcher leads the interviewee to choose a particular response rather than another, and restrict their freedom of answers. The third disadvantage is related to research ethics. In the case of interviewing, interviews do not permit the interview any anonymity. In that case, the interviewee is known to the researcher. The name is not hidden. Researchers should be aware of these disadvantages. Interview steps. Conducting interviews can be done face-to-face, on the phone, or via email. These are recognized forms, although the face-to-face form is more common. Of course, with the advancement of communication technologies, more forms are recognized, such as online interviews. The act of interviewing needs some skills on the part of the researcher. These skills are conversational skills, in fact. Without acquiring these skills, using an interview may completely fail. That's why the researcher should learn about the steps of conducting interviews. They should follow, in fact, some steps to optimize the outcomes of interviewing. Step 1 is selecting respondents and arranging interviews. The selection of the respondents is done via choosing certain sampling strategies, arranging the interviews, arranging the date of the interview, the time and the place. The researcher should have appointments with the interviewees, and he should select a place where there is less noise. The second step is drafting questions and the interview guide. Here some researchers or some people use the term guide instead of the term schedule. The researcher should be very careful in drafting the questions. The questions should not be ambiguous. The outline of the topics to be covered, the topics that will be covered by the interview, should be well defined before the interview, and the researcher should bear in mind his research questions, so that he gathers data that will enable him to answer the questions, and he should avoid gathering irrelevant data. The order of the questions, in case the researcher is using a structured or semi-structured interview, is very important, and this should be fixed before interviewing the respondents. Step 3 is conducting the interview. Interviewers should be professional, and they should establish good rapport with the interviewee. This is done to gain their trust. The researcher should use an acceptable degree of formality. I don't mean that the conversation will be highly formal or highly informal, but the researcher should control the degree of formality and should make the interviewee feel comfortable. The researcher should always keep in mind that he or she should be professional. Another aspect of this step is related to seeking the respondent's permission on whether they will use recording or alternative tools. Ethically, if you will be recording the speech of the interviewee, you should gain their permission beforehand. You should also gain their permission regarding any device to record the answers, such as the booklets, electronic tablets, laptops, computers, or smaller notebook computers. Finally, the researcher should ensure that the answers of the participants will be confidential, and this should be explicitly said to the participants. The second data collection tool that we shall discuss is questionnaires. A questionnaire is a data elicitation method which consists of a series of written questions. In that case, the questions are not oral, they are written. In this method, the respondents are presented with questions or statements to which they are to react either by writing out their answers or choosing among existing answers. This depends on the types of questions. The questions are intended to obtain responses which can then be straightforwardly submitted to statistical analysis. Questionnaires are often used for extensive data collection. They are used to collect huge amounts of data because they are generally quick and easy for participants to complete. Completing a questionnaire can take only a few minutes. Questionnaires are useful in measurements, that is to say, they are used to measure certain phenomena. It is possible to classify the questions in a questionnaire according to their content into 3 types: factual questions, behavioral questions, and attitudinal questions. Factual questions, which are also called subject descriptors, are used to gather information on who the respondents are, about the respondents themselves, their identity. This includes demographic characteristics like age, gender, and race, if this is relevant to one's study, residential location, marital and socioeconomic status, level of education, religion, occupation, mother tongue, or any other background information. We can say that factual questions gather data or facts on the respondents themselves. The researcher should gather the background information which is relevant for one's research question and should avoid gathering information that is irrelevant. Secondly, behavioral questions are used to investigate the participants' actions, what they do. For example, their lifestyles, their habits, and personal history. Behavioral questions, as I said, aim at gathering data on what people do. If we take, for example, the context of second language studies, the behavioral questions may be about the use of teaching methodologies, for example, learning strategies, correction techniques. Of course, the questions should be relevant to whether the respondent is a teacher or a learner. The last category of questions according to their content are attitudinal questions. These are used to discover what people think, their attitudes, their opinions, their beliefs, their interests, and their values. Like any research tools, questionnaires have strengths and weaknesses. Firstly, questionnaires are very efficient regarding time, effort, and financial resources. That is to say, they are quicker and cheaper. They do not require the same skills as is the case of interviews. Questionnaires permit researchers to gather large-scale data, very huge data, in a short time. This is simply done because samples which receive questionnaires are very large samples. Sometimes hundreds or thousands of people can take a questionnaire. The analysis of data is easy and fast, especially if it is electronically treated. If the researcher, for example, uses Google Form, the results are analyzed on the spot. Now we come to talk about the disadvantages or the weaknesses of using questionnaires. The first weakness is that when using a questionnaire, the researchers force their perspectives on the participants through the questions. This happens because most of the time the questions in a questionnaire are closed-ended. That is to say, the options are already prepared for the respondent, and there is no room for a personal or a unique answer. The second weakness is that questionnaires provide superficial data. These data are usually in the form of numbers. It is true that numbers are powerful, but numbers remain as a powerless tool because they do not involve deeper meanings. That is why sometimes researchers who use questionnaires have a follow-up stage, which is using an interview after the questionnaire to go deeper into some points within the questionnaire. The third weakness is that questionnaires may involve unreliable and non-motivated respondents. Here, the respondent may not say the truth. If you want to check the performance, for example, of a respondent on a given skill, or to ask them about their proficiency in a language, if a respondent gives you an answer, this does not necessarily mean that this answer is true. And here, other tools like tests would be better. Also, the respondent may not be motivated to participate or to take the questionnaire, and this will influence the quality of the answers. The third or the next problem with questionnaires, because they are written, sometimes some respondents have literacy problems. They cannot read well, or they have difficulty in understanding written material, so using a questionnaire would not be appropriate. Next, the researcher is sometimes unable to check the seriousness and accuracy of answers, because the answering the questions is not done face-to-face. Also, this happens because the answers are written. Questionnaires also involve the participant's self-deception. That is to say, seeing the world the way the respondent wishes it, rather than the way it is in reality. Another weakness in using questionnaires or written questions is that people sometimes, or the respondents, have the tendency to choose what sounds or what seems good and avoid being negative. Here they try to please the researcher. This happens especially when they talk about their behavior or when they talk about their attitudes. Also, the respondents may have the tendency to overgeneralize their judgments. Here, this always happens due to the influence or the attempt to be positive. Finally, a long questionnaire, especially if it contains a lot of pages, can be subject to inaccuracy due to fatigue factors. The respondent sometimes gets tired of answering the questions, especially a long list of questions, and that's why the answers themselves are not accurate or exact. In spite of all these weaknesses, many researchers tend to use questionnaires rather than other tools simply because they are easy to administer and they are standardized. Also, they are very easy to analyze. Now we discuss the structure of a questionnaire. Since the questionnaire is a written document, it has a standardized structure that the researchers should know about. It has sections that should be followed. The first section is the title. A questionnaire should have a title. The title generally suggests the area of investigation. For example, a questionnaire on the attitudes of teachers of writing on the use of a certain strategy. This is usually extracted from research questions. The second element in a questionnaire is the instructions. Usually we have two types of instructions. A general instruction, this is called the introduction. Of course, the heading introduction is not used. It takes the form of a paragraph that appears at the very beginning of the questionnaire. This general instruction should be provided at the beginning about what is generally required from the participant. The researcher explains what he wants in general from the participant to do. This is something about the study as a whole. Of course, this should not be very explicit in order not to influence the responses of the participants. The next type of instructions are specific instructions for each new task. Because the questionnaire has other sections, it is necessary to give an instruction for each section. The specific instructions should be clear enough and they should not allow multiple interpretations. For example, another point is that they should be expressed in a polite form. The third section is the questionnaire items. We mean by the term items questions. The questions themselves. This is the body of the questionnaire. Usually, the body of the questionnaire has sections. The first section is the demographic section, and the second one is the main part. Here, the main part may have subsections as well. The demographic section concerns the participants' demographic information. Facts about the participants. Typically, it includes categories for the participants to select from. That is to say, the questions are closed-ended. The main part here includes both open-ended and closed-ended questions. The third element is usually the largest element in a questionnaire. The fourth element includes extra information. This is a brief supplementary information part in which the author can request further marginal data, like contact mode, how to contact the researcher, questionnaire returning method, how should the respondent return the questionnaire, or any note that the researcher would like to add. Here, this section is just a marginal part in the questionnaire. At the end, the researcher should add a closing thank you. The participants should be thanked for their participation. It is important for the researcher to know how to write questionnaire items. and in fact, these items have a lot of forms or types. They can be categorized into two major types: the closed-ended questions and the open-ended questions. The researcher can use only closed-ended questions or open-ended questions, but it is preferable to mix both types. In a questionnaire, the most common question type is the closed-ended questions. The major benefit of closed-ended questions is that their analysis is clear-cut and leaves no space for rater bias. It does not leave space for the subjectivity of the analyst, because the answers themselves are clear. It's not possible for the researcher or the analyst to add any further interpretation. And this is a high degree of objectivity. Therefore, these questions are sometimes called objective items. These items can be of the following types, which appear in the figure. Here, the first type of closed-ended questions, so they are called closed-ended questions or sometimes close-ended questions. The first type I said is the rating scale type. The rating scale type. These questions have a scale. It means some points which are ordered. The first category or the first type of rating scales is Likert scale. The Likert scale contains degrees. For example, strongly agree, neither agree nor disagree, and strongly disagree. These are the points of the scale, and they are ordered from the lowest to the highest. The next type of scale is the semantic differential scale. They concern difficulty, so they are ordered from the from the lowest point to the highest, or vice versa. For example, the first point is difficult and the last point is easy, and in between there are other degrees which are decided by the researcher. In both types, the respondent will choose only one answer, and this will be easy to calculate for the researcher. The next type is the numerical rating scale. Here, the respondent is given numbers, like for example from 1 to 5, and each number has a meaning. This has to do with the frequency of doing something. For example, 1 means not at all, 2 means not really, 3 means so-so, 4 means quite a lot, and 5 means very much. This is very suitable to talk about behaviors in behavioral questions. Next, the next type of rating scales is the true-false. Here, the respondent has two options, either yes or no. Another category of close-ended questions is multiple choice. Here, the researcher provides the respondent with choices, like for example A, B, C, and sometimes D or more, with text here. For example, I speak English, I speak French, I speak Arabic. And the respondent has to choose one or more. This is to be specified by the researcher. Rank order questions are the other type of close-ended questions. Here, the researcher provides a list of items or statements, and he asks the respondent to provide numbers for these statements. In a way, the respondent will order the items. For example, from the least necessary to the most necessary. For example, the researcher will provide the respondent with a list of language skills: writing, reading, speaking, and listening. And according to the respondent's situation or occupation, he would order the skills according to their importance for him. Another type is called numeric items. Here, this involves specifying a particular value within an anticipated range of numbers. The researcher provides a range of numbers. For example, how old are you? This is the question. And the options are 15, 20, 21, 25, 26, 30. Here, the respondent will choose the range where his age falls. At last, we have checklists or checkboxes. This involves marking items that apply in a list. For instance, the question is, what are the characteristics of a good teacher? And the researcher provides a number of characteristics in the form of a list, either phrases or statements, and then he asks the respondent to mark the characteristics that he thinks are the characteristics of a good teacher. Here, the respondent may choose more than one answer. In the case of multiple choice questions, he chooses only one answer, but in the case of checklists, he may have more than one answer. Then, the researcher will calculate the frequency of those characteristics which are more common among the respondents. Now we come to the second major category of questionnaire items. These are the open-ended questions. In the open-ended questions, the researcher does not provide possibilities of answer. He leaves this to the respondent. That's why they are open-ended. Here they have four types. The first type is the specific open. Here the researcher asks about concrete pieces of information. For example, what is your first language? The second type or kind is the clarification open-ended question, and these usually come after yes or no questions, like explain why. This is a clarification open-ended question. Or it can appear in the form of please specify. Another way of writing an open-ended question is to choose the sentence completion. For example, the following statement is provided: one thing I like about this activity is, and then the answer is left to the respondent. In language studies, those studies which try to elicit information about the respondent's proficiency level, usually sentence completion is used. Finally, open-ended questions can appear in the form of can require a short answer, like, what did you like about the workshop? Here, the respondent obviously will provide a precise piece of information. We come now to the last part about questionnaires. About designing questionnaires, we'll provide some tips. The first thing that should be emphasized when designing a questionnaire is the wording and the order of the sections. The wording of a questionnaire should be clear. The items or everything that is included in a questionnaire should not have multiple interpretations. So the words should be carefully selected. The researcher also should avoid using highly technical terms which are ambiguous for a non-specialist. He should look at the questionnaire from the angle of the participant and not from the theoretical angle of the researcher. So the language should be simple. The sections of the questionnaire should be ordered carefully. The questions and the items themselves have to be thoughtfully ordered, and this is related to the aims of the study. Next, the researchers can design their own questionnaires. They create their own questionnaires. Another option is that they can use an existing model questionnaire taken from another study. But in case they do this, they have to recognize or acknowledge the source of the questionnaire. When using others' models, the researcher should acknowledge having borrowed or adapted it. Next, in case the researcher develops an original questionnaire, his own questionnaire, the researcher may refer to the related literature. He should extensively read the relevant literature to gain more knowledge about the topic and to gather some initial content for the questionnaire items. If the researcher does not read sufficiently the relevant literature and previous studies, and because the questionnaire is most of the time contains close-ended questions, the questionnaire may generate very poor data. It is also recommended that researchers interview a small number of participants, like students, teachers, administrators, etc. This depends on the study, to reach the required content for their questionnaires. So here, in that case, the interview is used just as a tool to find the categories for the questionnaire. Finally, it is important that questionnaires are well formatted, piloted, and non-ambiguous. Formatting here has to do with the shape of the questionnaire, the writing, the font type, the size of the text. Piloting means using the questionnaire with a small sample, a few participants, in order to see whether its content is adequate or not, and to be able to make some modifications before administering the questionnaire to the larger sample. The items of the questionnaire, as I said previously, should not be ambiguous. They should be clear enough. And finally, the length of the questionnaire should be convenient. It shouldn't be an extremely long questionnaire so that the respondent does not get tired of answering or responding to the questionnaire. Among the widely used data collection methods is observation. Observation refers to a set of research methods wherein the emphasis is on capturing or describing the dynamic or temporal nature of behavior in the environment where it naturally occurs. This means that when the behavior is occurring in a given setting, the researcher is observing it. To collect data using observation, the researcher immerses himself or herself in a research setting. He lives in the setting. He attends the setting and observes what is happening. This method of data collection is widely used in human sciences, where we have participants, human participants, and the settings vary considerably. The setting, for example, can be a classroom, it can be a church, a hospital, a prison, the street. These are situations or places in which behaviors happen and where different phenomena also take place. These can be observed by the researcher directly. Immersing oneself in the setting is followed or accompanied at the same time by a systematic description of that setting, the interactions in the setting, how people interact, the relationships, what kinds of relationships exist between people within the setting, the actions, it means what people do, and the events, etc., within that setting. The aim of observation is to provide careful description of the subject's activities without influencing the events in which the subjects are engaged. The researcher does not exert any manipulation in the context. He only observes. This method offers an investigator the opportunity to gather live data from naturally occurring social situations. Situations like home, a work environment, the street, and so on. The use of observation enables the researcher to gather data or information on a variety of settings. And here we have types of settings. This is related to the goal of the study, the objective of the researcher. The first type of setting is the physical setting. For example, the physical environment and its organization. In some types of research, the physical environment is important, like in cultural studies. The researcher may be interested in the objects themselves which exist in the environment and how they are arranged, how they are organized. The task of the researcher is to provide a description of this physical setting. Another type of setting is the human setting. This means the organization of people, for example, within a family or within a tribe. The characteristics and makeup of the groups, how the groups are formed, or the individuals being observed, for instance, in terms of gender or class. The description of human settings permits the researcher to gather information on social groups. The third type of setting is the interactional setting. This is related to interaction within a group. The interactions that are taking place, whether they are formal, informal, whether they are planned, unplanned, whether they are verbal, non-verbal, and so on. For instance, in an educational study, the interest of the researcher can be in the type of interaction between the teacher and the pupils, or the type of interaction between the pupils themselves, or what is called peer interaction. This can be described by the researcher, and it's always related to the goal of the study. This means that the research objectives dictate the type of setting that should be the focus for the researcher. Sometimes the setting can be a program setting, especially in educational contexts. For instance, the researcher is interested in evaluating programs, and here he can provide a description of the resources used in the program, the way they are organized, the pedagogical styles, the teaching styles, the curricula, the syllabi, and their organization. All these are part of the program setting, which can be described using observation. Let's talk now about the types of observation. Observation is a set of methods. It means that observation is not always done in the same way. As it is the case with interviews, observations can be classified into structured, unstructured, and semi-structured. This is related to one point which has already been described in interviews. It is a matter of the degree of control the researcher has over the content of the observation, or in other words, preparing categories to be looked for in a given setting, whether the researcher prepares categories or whether he just describes or observes from a fresh angle. Thus, observation can be structured, unstructured, or just semi-structured. We take the structured observation type. This type involves determining in advance what is being looked for. The observation categories are worked out beforehand. They are prepared beforehand in the form of a checklist. So the researcher has already in mind a picture, and he tries to verify whether certain categories do exist in the setting or they do not exist. The use of the checklist permits the researcher to tick when he observes the behavior or when he sees the category that he is looking for. He uses a check mark. This is an easy and a rapid way to gather data, but it should be preceded by a thorough review of literature to enable the researcher to have richer categories. The second type, which is the semi-structured observation, is semi-controlled in the sense that it contains an array of issues, a list of general issues, but the data are collected, the data which are related to these issues are collected to further understand these issues in a less controlled way. In this type, the researcher goes deeper. He starts from a list of general issues, but he goes deeper and can discover unknown details, but still controls the scope of the observed phenomena. The last type of observation is the unstructured observation. This is free, in the sense that the researcher does not prepare any category beforehand. He explores the situation without any preconceived categories in mind. This type is open. The findings are much richer than the previous types because the categories are to be found. They are not prepared beforehand by the researcher. But the problem or the difficulty in this type of observation is that the task of interpreting the findings is relatively more demanding.
Data collection methods, focus groups. Focus group is a group interview. It is a qualitative research method which involves a number of participants in a collective discussion led by a trained facilitator or a moderator. The aim of the moderator is to direct the group discussion and keep it focused on specific topics. Typically, focus groups engage 7 to 12 people for about 60 to 90 minutes to discuss the topic under investigation. We understand from this that the researcher conducts an interview, but in that case, he involves a number of people at the same time. Focus groups have a well-defined goal. Their goal is to elicit the participants' perceptions, opinions, and attitudes, but in a collective manner. The selection of participants is very important in focus groups. The participants are selected on the basis of common features or qualities or characteristics and similar backgrounds, so that they can discuss the same topic. Here, the moderator will use questioning, oral questioning, and his questioning approach can be structured or unstructured. It means the researcher can prepare questions beforehand or can have some degree of freedom in asking the questions. Here it is very important to say that the more structured the approach of the researcher, the less chances to discover new insights and the less messy the data. This means that less structured ways of conducting a focus group are preferred. But at the same time, the data which is generated from an unstructured focus group is more difficult to analyze. Since focus groups are or can involve a number of people at the same time, this means that there is interaction between them. So the collection of data in a focus group depends on successful management of group dynamics, how to manage a group talking together, and how to manage interaction. The aim is for all members to contribute without marginalizing one of the members and to share their views and feelings. Focus groups are not any group of people talking. There are distinguishing characteristics of this form of data collection. The following are the most important ones. The first distinctive characteristic is that the questions in a focus group are focused. They are not. These discussions are not random discussions. Also, there is no push for agreement or consensus. This means that the researcher does not aim at reaching a common agreement upon a topic. The researcher instead is interested in the diversity of opinions. The environment in a focus group is permissive and non-threatening. The participants feel at ease in this type of discussion because they have peers with whom they feel comfortable. The participants in a focus group are homogeneous because the researcher is interested in a group of people who share some similar characteristics. The group size is reasonable. Focus groups should not contain a large number of participants so that the moderator can control the discussion. In a focus group, the patterns and trends in the opinions are examined across groups. This means that the researcher can have a number of focus group discussions and he can compare the opinions across these groups. Also, the group is guided by a skillful moderator. The presence of the moderator makes the discussion a bit organized because the moderator sometimes may intervene to assign turns to the different participants in order to make them talk. Finally, the analysis of a focus group data fits the study. It is related directly to the objectives of the study. Strengths and weaknesses of using focus groups as a data collection tool. Similar to the other data collection methods, focus groups have strengths and weaknesses. Indeed, focus groups are powerful because, firstly, their social setting creates a comfortable environment that encourages the participants to share their views. Also, this method is flexible enough to be used for dissimilar research goals. This can be exploratory, explanatory, or mixed methods. At last, focus group environments generate a large amount of data and a wide range of views with a limited influence from the researcher. On the other hand, there are some weaknesses. For instance, if the moderator is not skilled enough to control the discussion, the flow of the discussion becomes uncontrollable and may generate redundant data. Because here the participants will talk about things which are not related to the goals of the researcher. Furthermore, there is a possibility that one participant will dominate the discussion. Hence, this will minimize the contributions of the others, or that the participants follow group talk and fail to express their own views. Since the researcher is interested in the variety of views, some efforts should be made in order to control who speaks. All the participants should say something during the discussion. The last weakness of focus groups is that this type of research is not cheap. Sometimes it requires some extra costs. It requires time, also it requires effort in both the collection stage and the analysis stages. The last data collection method that we shall discuss is tests. Before talking about tests as data collection methods, it is important to make some clarification regarding the use of the term test itself. In research methodology discussions, the word test appears in different contexts. The first context is data collection methods. A test is considered as one among the data collection methods like interviews, questionnaires, and so on. The second sense of test in research methodology is statistical tests. These are calculations that researchers use when analyzing the data. So in this video, we'll take tests as a data collection method and not as a statistical tool. Let's first define tests. A test is a specific type of measure. Here we have the notion of measuring or measurement. One which purports to provide an indication of a test taker's real-world ability or competence in a particular domain. We understand here that the test is a measurement tool. It measures ability or knowledge of something. This is similar to the measurements that we make in the physical world. For example, we can measure the length of something, or we can measure the height, or we can measure the weight. To make these measurements in the physical world, we need a scale. Of course, the task is easy with concrete objects. We can measure, for example, the weight in terms of kilograms using a specific scale. In research, we can measure any phenomenon if we manage to create a good test. We can measure motivation, for example. We can measure speaking skill. We can measure stress. It is important to create tests in research so that the researcher can measure the different constructs and he can study the relationships between them, for instance. If your study is about the relationship between intrinsic motivation and the speaking skill, you cannot make any relationship between these two variables, or you cannot show that there is a relationship between them unless you create a measure firstly for intrinsic motivation, how much intrinsic motivation a participant has, and also a measure for the speaking skill, how much or to what extent is the speaker skillful. Once you have numbers indicating both variables, you can see whether there is a relationship between them or not. That's why you see the importance of testing in data collection. So the test is a procedure used to collect data on the subject's ability or knowledge. In a test, some stimuli are presented to individuals and they require a response. So in any test, there should be some response on the part of the participants. Based on this response, the tester or the researcher will assign a numeral or a score which indicates the measure of the quality which is being tested. For example, an oral proficiency test or an intelligence test will yield a score which reflects the individual's level of oral proficiency or level of intelligence. It is important to say that tests are not only linked to language abilities, but they can measure any phenomenon. Tests are very widely used in research, including educational and psychological research. In education, for example, tests cover all aspects of a student's life and for all ages, whether the students are young, children, or adults. The following are examples of phenomena or constructs which can be subject to testing. We can have aptitude, attainment, personality, social adjustment, attitudes and values, stress and burnout, performance of a certain activity, potential, ability, achievement, diagnosis of difficulties, intelligence, verbal and non-verbal reasoning, higher order thinking, performance in school subjects, including language, introversion and extraversion, self-esteem, locus of control, depression and anxiety, reading, readiness, university entrance tests, interest inventories, language proficiency tests, motivation and interest, sensory and perceptual tests, special abilities and disabilities, etc. You notice here that we can measure anything. We should just be able to construct an appropriate test. Test types. Testing or using tests depends on a number of features. These are related to the choice of the test itself. Here, the researcher can have the possibility to buy a ready-made test. These are commercially produced tests. Or the researcher can produce his own test, and these are called researcher-produced tests. Commercially produced tests are ready-made published tests. They can be copyright or open access. It means they can be free, or they can sometimes require payment on the part of the researcher. Usually, the commercially produced tests have a number of features which make them good for research. They are objective and they have been piloted and refined. They have been standardized across a named population, for example, in a region of the country, the whole country, a particular age group, or various age groups, so that they represent a wide population. In this type of tests, they declare how reliable and valid they are. So their reliability and validity are established beforehand. These tests also come complete with instructions for administration. They include well-defined instructions on how to use them. These tests are often straightforward and quick to administer and to mark. They are easy to use and they are easy to mark. Another quality of these tests is that they are accompanied with guides which help the researcher to interpret the data. These are usually included in the manual of the test. But commercially produced tests are expensive to purchase sometimes and also to administer. Another weakness of the commercially produced tests is that they are not tailored to institutional or local contexts. They were tested in other contexts, and this does not necessarily mean that they are appropriate for the researcher's contexts and the researcher's needs. So sometimes they are not suitable for the purposes of the researcher. So if the researcher wants to avoid these two weaknesses of the commercially produced tests, he or she should design or produce their own tests. Here the researcher produced tests have objectives and content which are fitted or suitable to the specific needs of the researcher in a given social or educational context. These tests are usually tailored to the local and institutional context very tightly. They fit the purposes of the researcher. They satisfy the feature of fitness of purpose. Now let's say something on a specific type of tests, which are called pre-tests and post-tests. As we have explained previously, pre-tests and post-tests are used in experiments in which the researcher has two groups, the experimental group and the control group, and where tests are administered before the researcher's intervention and after the intervention to see if there is a significant difference and to study cause-effect relationships. Pre-tests and post-tests are therefore used in explanatory research. Here there are some criteria, or there are some conditions that should be met when we design pre-tests and post-tests. Firstly, the pre-test may have questions which differ in form or wording from the post-test, though the two tests must test the same content. They should have the same objectives. The pre-test must be the same for the control and experimental groups. Also, the post-test must be the same for both groups. This is very necessary in experiments. Otherwise, the experiment will not yield valid data. Next, care must be taken in the construction of a post-test to avoid making the test easier to complete by one group than another. This will ensure the comparability of the results. The level of difficulty must be the same in both tests. If the researcher is using a test in their research, test construction is very important. This follows a number of steps. Firstly, the researcher should identify the purposes of the test. What is the researcher measuring exactly? For example, the researcher may be interested in measuring knowledge of some grammatical forms, or knowledge of some area of lexis, or speaking ability, writing ability, reading ability, etc. Of course, all these examples are about the area of language testing. The second step is to identify the test specifications, whether the test is commercially produced or it is researcher designed. Third, the researcher should select the contents of the test, the parts or the test items. Next, the researcher should consider the form of the test, its layout. Then the researcher will write the test items. Sixth, the researcher should consider the layout of the test, the general appearance of the test, to ensure phase validity. And also, the researcher should consider the timing of the test. This shouldn't be ignored. The final aspect of test construction is the scoring of the test. This should be made very clear to allow the researcher to compare the results of each participant. Preparing a scoring scale will ensure the reliability of the test. Validity and reliability are very important features of tests, and they must be ensured by the researcher. Validity means testing what it is intended to test, and the reliability means giving the same results if the test is repeated with the same subject. So far we have spoken about tests in general. Let's narrow our discussion to language tests. It means using tests to measure language ability. I suggest that we make this narrowing because you will be constructing tests that deal most of the time with language abilities. When measuring language ability like vocabulary or grammar or writing accuracy or speaking fluency, the researcher should distinguish or put in mind two types of tests. This depends on their explicitness. So some tests may have high explicitness and other tests may have low explicitness. Here, what do we mean by explicitness? For example, if you ask students to write a paragraph on a topic that they choose, like holidays or any other topic, then you will use these paragraphs in order to focus on some grammatical items, for example, the use of tenses. For the respondent, this represents a spontaneous use of language. Of course, this is the case of writing. In the case of speaking, you may ask someone to speak about a certain topic freely and in a spontaneous manner. Then you will focus on some of the aspects of their speech. So the researcher can focus on some aspects within speech or writing which is produced spontaneously. For the participant doesn't know what is being evaluated in their speech or their writing. So in that case, the language aspects which are being evaluated or assessed or measured, to use the right term, are not explicit to the participant. They are not clear to the participant. In that case, we say that the test is of low explicitness. So tests of low explicitness collect, record, or gather language which is produced spontaneously, often without the subjects being aware that the language is being assessed. For high explicitness tests, the researcher will use elicitation techniques. It means asking for a particular language form. Using these elicitation techniques, the subjects are required to answer predetermined questions or to select among a number of alternatives based on a given text, or to fill in the blanks. For example, you may say, for instance, choose the right form of the verb, or you may ask the respondent to conjugate the verb, or to select a preposition, or to select a lexical item, or to select a language, a sentence construction rather than another sentence construction. In this case, the form which is being measured is clear through the test, and it is that form which is elicited and not the rest of language. So if you are interested in tenses, you will ask the participants to produce tense forms or verb forms. If we compare this to writing a paragraph where the researcher is interested in tenses, we see that firstly, in the high explicitness test, the writing or the speaking is not spontaneous. It is guided. It's not natural. And this is a weakness of high explicitness tests. But of course, they have their strengths, especially in data analysis and in reliability. Low explicitness tests yield or produce more natural data. So this aspect makes them more representative of the ability of the speaker or the writer. High explicitness tests are easy to score, and low explicit tests are sometimes difficult to score. The language which is elicited through a high explicitness test is a decontextualized language. It is not a language form that is put in its real context of use, whereas the language that is produced or elicited from low explicitness tests is more natural, and it is produced within its natural context. It is contextualized. Let's continue our discussion on language tests by considering language testing techniques. So in order to elicit some language, any type of language from the respondents, the researcher can use a variety of testing techniques to collect the data. We'll begin with those of high explicitness and move along the continuum toward those of low explicitness. The first type is judgment tests. This is an elicitation technique where the test taker is presented with correct and incorrect language items, some expressions in language, and is expected to decide whether they are acceptable or not acceptable. So it's a matter of acceptability or appropriateness. This procedure is widely used to test the metalinguistic ability of learners, for example, and this ability is believed to indicate competence in the language. When you are able to distinguish between what is acceptable and not acceptable, what is appropriate and not appropriate, this is part of your competence. This can involve even pieces of discourse. The next technique is multiple choice. This technique requires the test taker to select a correct answer from a number of alternatives. You see that this is highly explicit. Usually this is based on a text or a stimulus that precedes the choices. It is used to test, for example, reading, listening, grammar, vocabulary, and writing. True or false, this procedure requires the test taker to determine whether a statement is correct or incorrect. This is often based on a text or an oral stimulus and is usually used for testing grammar, vocabulary, reading, listening, or metalinguistics, as in the judgment tests mentioned earlier. Another possible technique is elicited imitation. The test taker is presented with an oral or reading stimulus and is expected to repeat it or read it aloud. It is used for testing pronunciation and comprehension. Of course, we should say that the choice of the testing technique depends on the aims of the study and the constructs which are being measured. Next is the cloze test or gut feeling test. The subject is presented with a written or oral text from which a number of words or letters, clauses or sentences or whatever have been deleted. There are gaps. The subject is expected to fill in the missing parts, to complete the missing parts. This is used for testing reading, writing, and overall language proficiency. It is said that cloze tests have the power to measure several competencies at the same time. For example, lexical competence, grammatical competence, etc. Completions. The subject is presented with a partial oral or written questions. It means part of the statement, and is expected to complete them orally or in writing. This procedure is used to test aspects such as reading strategies, writing, vocabulary, grammar, speech acts, and so on. For example, in the case of measuring the use of speech acts, a short conversation is provided where the question or the first participant in the conversation's let's say statement is provided, while the test taker is required to add the response to the first participant's speech. The next technique is recall or remembering. Here, after reading or listening, for example, to a stimulus, the subjects are asked to write down or to report orally all that they can recall from the text in their first language or in their second language. This is a widely used tool for researching the process of reading and listening, in fact. The above mentioned techniques are of high explicitness. Let's now take some other techniques which have a low degree of explicitness. We begin by oral interviews. This is a technique used to collect data on the oral language of the subjects. In this procedure, oral language is assessed in an interview with the subject talks to the interviewer on a variety of topics. It is open. Now, the focus of the researcher will be on the subject's pronunciation, fluency, use of language forms like grammatical forms or lexical forms, and various other features of all language use can all be assessed through the procedure. A similar technique is role play and simulation. Here the subject and the tester act out given roles. They take roles or they imitate real life situations. These are effective procedures for collecting more natural language which is interactional in nature. The advantage of role plays and simulations is that the subjects are able to participate effectively in role plays and they produce more natural language samples. Added to this is the use of observational procedures. In that case, the researcher collects data about the subject's use of language in a variety of real-life contexts and situations without the subjects realizing that they are being assessed. Finally, reviewing documents can be another procedure by which the written language ability of the subjects is collected from various types of written documents. This is done without giving the subject any official test. In this case, the researcher may deduce facts about the subject's writing ability from letters or notes to peers or homework and so on. We come now to the conclusion of data collection methods lecture. We have seen that the process of data collection represents the central element leading to answering the research questions. In empirical studies, it's impossible to answer the questions without having data. The researchers can use a multitude of instruments, those which were presented earlier, like interviews, questionnaires, tests, and so on, to obtain the data. And this depends on the goals of research and the approach that is and the methodology which are adopted. The data collection stage requires that researchers act skillfully. The researchers should know how to construct and use each tool. It is important to know about each tool, about its strengths, about its weaknesses, about how it is designed, and about how it is used. This requires both theoretical knowledge about these methods, and this is what we have attempted to provide you with. Knowledge about their strengths and weaknesses, as I have said, and training in instrument design and administration. The researcher should be trained sufficiently in designing or constructing the tool, and also in using the tool in reality. Finally, we should say that if data collection is systematically done, researchers would avoid both lack of evidence, lack of data, and at the same time redundancy of data.